Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle. Sheldon, it looks like things in Iraq are just going from bad to worse. This certainly doesn't surprise anyone. Certainly doesn't surprise libertarians. It's a hellhole. It's an absolute hellhole. George W. Bush invades his country under the false pretense of WMDs, that Saddam Hussein's getting ready to unleash mushroom clouds, and they had all that nonsense, really, that was designed to scare the American people into supporting this little latest intervention. But when they didn't fire the WMDs, of course, libertarians weren't surprised, but they stayed there. And they decided, boy, they're going to make this a model society in the Middle East. It's going to bring the whole Middle East out of this world of chaos and crisis and death and destruction. And they're going to really show how things are going to be done. They build this model society in accordance with this vision of the Pentagon and the CIA. And it's just a hellhole. And you've got a dictatorship that is really no different from Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. This is part of the reason why people are welcoming the anti-government militants that are now sweeping toward Baghdad. And now you have all the dead enders, the neocons, the interventionists saying, let's do it again. Let's get in there and kill more people. That's all we need is drones and bombers. And so far they're only sending advisory troops, but once some of those advisory troops get killed, then what's going to be their answer? And this is their modus. It's been their modus since at least World War II. Just death and destruction, empire, imperialism, paternalism, and we're now reaping the fruits of what we've seen over there with this interventionism. And what's your take on it?
Well, I agree. There's been outside intervention in that region for a very long time, and I don't see how people think continued outside intervention is going to bring a peace to this area. It seems to me the people are going to have to figure it out for themselves, work it out. The idea that the U.S. can send in a couple of hundred, up to maybe 500, almost 600 advisors, and I use quotation marks around advisors. I think that's going to make a difference. I really think they're sort of dreaming. One of the analysts said recently that when you say only advisors, back in the Vietnam day, that was a punchline, because everybody knew that advisors aren't just advisors. And you're right, they're a tripwire, if nothing else. If there's a strike on where they are and they're killed or injured, what's the next step? Is Obama then going to be forced, even if he really doesn't want to? Is he going to be pressured by the more hawkish people to send the bombers in, send the drones, and then of course you're killing innocent people? And it's you're right. It's just a recipe for a mess. It's a mess now, but outside intervention, U.S. intervention in particular, is only going to make it a greater mess. Shed more blood and put blood on Americans' hands. I mean, the least we can do is keep the Americans from shedding blood. That would be of some help as far as as the American people's interest is concerned. Just keeping the blood off American hands by keeping our distance would be an advantage.
Yeah, because whoever's going to be killed is going to be angry, or at least their survivors are going to be angry. And then we've got, the terrorist attacks coming again, just like we got with 9/11, and before that, the 93 attacks on the World Trade Center, the attacks on the USS Cole. I mean, you and I have been writing about this since at least the 1991, the Persian Gulf intervention. And we've shown even before that the U.S. partnership with Saddam Hussein when they were helping him kill Iranians during the Iraq-Iran war. We were talking about the sanctions throughout the 90s that were contributing to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. So, we've been talking about this concept of interventionism with respect to the Middle East, and specifically for Iraq since 1990 or thereafter. But you came up with a really interesting article this last Friday in your TGIF, and for those of you that are watching this video, that are not familiar with our work at the Future of Freedom Foundation, Sheldon does an op-ed for us every week, along with a monthly article in our journal, Future of Freedom. But he also does a fantastic column on Fridays that is a more in-depth analysis of what's going on in the world or what's going on with libertarian principles. And it's always thought-provoking. It goes to a deeper level. And this last Friday, was really fascinating. It was entitled "The Middle East Harvest Bitter Imperialist Fruit." And it's still online on our homepage at fff.org. It's really worth looking at. But Sheldon, in this article, I'd like you to talk a little bit about it during this half hour. Because what you're saying in this article is that the problems that we're facing in the Middle East don't just have to do with U.S. interventionism since the Persian Gulf War and the sanctions and then, of course, the invasion in 2003. You trace these articles back a lot further. So would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the general point is that while this is a very complicated story, one overlooked aspect is that the Arab Islamic world has not been permitted to evolve free of outside intervention. And since World War I, free of outside, non-Islamic intervention. In other words, foreigners, mainly Europeans and then later Americans, who were not Muslims, have been interfering with what would otherwise be a natural evolution, I think, of that area. And so what that article focused on was in particular World War I, because this area that we generally known as Arabia, although we can subdivide it into various districts and provinces, were ruled for hundreds of years, 400 years or so, by the Turks under the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire since the 19th century had been crumbling. It was known as the sick man of Europe. The other imperial powers, Britain, France, and Russia, were nibbling away at it, more than nibbling. I mean, in 1882, the British take control of Egypt after sowing discontent, local discontent with Turkish rule. Because even though the Turks are Muslims, the Arabs resented that they were being ruled by Turks, even though the Turks increasingly allowed more and more autonomy. But it was weak. Like I say, their empire was crumbling. The British and the French were taking advantage of where the Turks were weak, and like I say, a big prize fell to the British in 1882 when they took over Egypt and remained. I'm sure they promised to the Egyptians that if we get you free of the Turks, we'll leave you alone. But of course they didn't. They stayed and ruled. So when World War I came along, the Ottoman Empire was on the side of of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Central Powers. And the British got the idea that if they could get the Arabs to revolt against the Turks, that would be like a rear action guard, harassing the Turks, weakening the Turks, distracting the Turks, and weakening their war effort on behalf of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they dispatched T.E. Lawrence, Thomas Edward Lawrence. You may recognize that name, Lawrence. He's the Lawrence of Arabia, famous David Lean movie, which won a slew of Academy Awards, I think, in 1964 or somewhere around there. And subject of many, many books. He was in love with that region. He went and told the leading Arabs of the leading families, basically the Hashemite family, that if they would help the British by harassing and rebelling against the Turks, that they could be independent after the war. It's controversial whether Lawrence believed that or not, whether he thought that was a sincere promise that he was carrying to the Arabs, or whether he knew that was not a sincere promise. But nevertheless, he told them that, and he was able to win over the leading Arabs, leading Arab families. And they proceeded then to blow up railroad lines and do other things, conquer Aqaba. They conquered some towns, some key things, and made a key contribution to harassing the Turks, reducing their ability to fight directly against the British and the French and help the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, unbeknownst to the Arabs, and whether it's unbeknown to Lawrence, I don't know, so I can't comment on that. the French and the British were cutting a deal in a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Russians are also just before the Russian Revolution, 1916, were a party to this. They set up a plan to, after the war, assuming they prevailed, to carve up the Middle East and to give part of it to France, part of it to England, and even parts that would be nominally independent would still be assigned to spheres of influence, British and French. This was a secret agreement. Of course, they couldn't tell anybody about it because the Arabs might not be so enthusiastic about overthrowing the Turks if they knew they were just going to get new overlords. However, an interesting thing happened in 1917. The Bolsheviks end up overthrowing the provisional government in Russia in the fall of 1917. And Lenin and Trotsky, while they're going through the Tsar's papers, find the agreement and publish it in order to embarrass the French and the English. In my view, this is the only noble thing that Trotsky and Lenin did. They embarrassed the imperial powers by saying, all your talk about independence is nonsense. You're secretly planning to carve it up. Also, don't forget Wilson, who was getting into the war in 1917, did talk about how there should not be territorial gains in this war, and he sort of was talking about self-determination, although his 14 points didn't really endorse self-determination in any genuine way. But anyway, it all became clear that the British and the French meant to carve up the Middle East and basically run it for themselves. Of course, they talked in terms of how these are undeveloped people, so we have the burden as being advanced and enlightened. We have the burden to bring them along. In other words, they're children, and we're the wise adults. And when we raise them to independence, then they can be independent. And all this, of course, got incorporated into the League of Nations Covenant. And meanwhile, also, of course, the British in 1917 promised the Zionist organization, the World Zionist Organization, which was their name. I mean, that was the name of the group that was seeking a Jewish state in Palestine. They gave their encouragement with the famous Balfour Declaration that said the king looks with favor upon the development of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So once again, the British and the French were disposing of land that did not belong to them. That's the upshot.
Well, this sounds pretty familiar, a familiar story, because when you were talking, I was thinking that, hey, isn't this what the U.S. government did in the Spanish-American War? I mean, here they told the Cubans and they told the Filipinos, others, that, hey, we're going to help free you from the control of the Spanish Empire. And then at the end of the war, it became clear that all that was just a lie, that the U.S. government, which was now expanding into an imperial role, was going to substitute itself in place of the Spanish Empire. And so you had this long-term agreement with Cuba, a forced agreement that's where the U.S. ends up with Guantanamo Bay and the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to straighten things out. And then a brutal war against the Filipinos, who were continuing to fight for their independence against the U.S. forces. And it sounds like this, from what you're saying, that this is essentially what happened with the British Empire and the French Empire. Maybe this is something inherent to empires, lying and deceiving people, that it was a clear double cross. They say, look, if you will help us secure this victory, we're going to let you be independent. You can make your own way, knowing the whole way that the British and the French empires were going to simply substitute themselves for the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it is so degenerate. It's just impossible to believe. But are you saying then that all these lines there are actually, what are you saying? Which lines were drawn as a result of this imperial finagling there?
Well, they drew the map that we basically know today. I mean, in the League of Nations Covenant, the infamous Article 22 said that these peoples, these Arabic provinces of the former Ottoman Empire are not able, this is a quote, are not able to stand up themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. And therefore they needed to be under the tutelage of the enlightened, grown-ups in France and England. So basically, the French were given what became Syria and Lebanon. That was part of the area known as the Levant. We're starting to hear that name now, the Levant, because the ISIS, we're hearing a lot about ISIS, of course, which is the Islamic State in Iraq and people think the S is Syria, but the S is not really Syria. The S is stands for the Arabic word for Levant, which is al-Sham, S-H-A-M. And so it's really for the Levant, which is more than Syria. We could say greater Syria. So the French were given greater Syria, which at one point in the very beginning, they had carved up the 6 states. In other words, they were drawing lines through tribes, through sects, dividing religious groups, because there were Muslims, there were Shiites, there were Sunni, there were Christians of various kinds, there were Druze, there were Kurds who were Muslims but are ethnically not Arabs. So you had all these different groups, and the French and the British thought, okay, we know how to divide things up, so they created states. England created Iraq, the state of Iraq. That area was known as Mesopotamia, but they created the state of Iraq. They created governments. They then put favored people on Arabs. They did put Arabs at the heads of governments, people who were beholden to the British. Arabs had gotten to Damascus before the French did and went ahead and created their own government. So actually there was some sort of self-government. I'm not saying it was democratic, but it was still Arab, at least. It wasn't outside. And when the French got there, they just brutally, kicked out, the guy who was going to be the king there. Sorry, I have a gnat flying around here. And so they kicked him out, and then the British took him and made him the king of Iraq. So you can see what they were doing there. They were playing their favorites. They had clients that they had paid in various ways who enjoyed the privileges. And if the British were going to put you on the throne, hey, you figured I got British protection, I got money, I'll take it. The British also got control of Palestine, which was a mandate. They dropped the traditional language of colonies. They actually talk about it. We won't call these places colonies. We'll call them mandates. The mandate is, sort of like protectorates. So the mandatory power was the guardian, right? The grown-up. The mandate was a bunch of little children, and this is the way they looked at it, that we need to bring to adulthood and independence. And so that's how it was, so they said, France, you're in charge of now, Lebanon eventually became 2 states, Lebanon and Syria. England, you have Iraq. You'll also oversee Palestine. And then the British, Jordan the area we called Jordan had been part of Palestine. So they just carved that off and made up a state called Transjordan, eventually just called Jordan. And they put one of the prominent heads, one of the people from one of the prominent families, as the king of Jordan, and that person's descendant, Abdullah, rules to this day. So, yeah, it was created by by the outside powers. We can see now why there's this problem. Let's keep in mind, ISIS is erasing the border between Iraq and Syria. They've now taken over a checkpoint between Iraq and Jordan. So they're even now moving to that area. So it's an undoing of Sykes-Picot and of the League of Nations Article 22. You might look at it that way. Unfortunately, it's violent and it will remain violent. They've never got the chance to just work things out. I'm not saying it wouldn't have been violent, but I have a feeling the violence would have burned out earlier because you wouldn't have that foreign issue. Anytime you got foreigners involved, then the enemies can use that against their enemies, right? One side can say, you're just an agent of a foreign power. So we have to kill you. And it brings out the more radical people, the people more prone to using violence. So I think it's fanned this flame, which might have burned out earlier, and there might have been a much more peaceful situation there today had the West stayed out.
Well, it just makes sense, especially when you consider this imperialist mindset and attitude toward people. The British and the French and now the Americans, the government officials, they go into these countries and they have this better than thou attitude. Like, we know what's best for you, and they look down their noses at people. I mean, that's the whole history of empires and colonies. And they look at people, as you say, as little children, subpar human beings. They expect to be adulated and adored, and the people in these countries resent this. I mean, they resent it to this day. You walk into a U.S. embassy, a foreigner does in Latin America or something, and they encounter this pompous, better than thou attitude from a diplomat. And that's the way it was with all these imperial forces in these countries, whether it was there in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, people hated it. And it's sometimes hard for Americans or British to understand that, because they're sitting there saying, oh, this is in your best interest. We're doing this for your own good. We know, we're educated, we're smarter, we're white. And so finally you have these horrible, violent uprisings against this type of thing. And it's just, to me, it's just imperial tyranny. And so that they draw these lines, and it looks like finally that things might be unraveling from this Sykes-Picot agreement that you're talking about, that this might be the beginning of a process that is undoing all of these artificial lines drawn in the sand by the French and British empires. And it looks like maybe the U.S. is involved with trying to preserve these old imperial lines in the sand. What do you think about that?
Yeah. No, that is what they are doing. Once in a while there's talk about, Iraq breaking up into 3 states, but I think the predominant opinion among policymakers is that shouldn't happen. A key thing to remember back at this time I'm talking about in 1919 was that nobody really cared what the Arabs thought, or what even the other ethnic groups thought there about this. The French and the English certainly didn't. Wilson was a little more interested in that. Wilson had said, we don't want to have charge of any mandate. So I guess in a relative sense, he was taking a better position. Of course, he shouldn't have brought the U.S. into the war, and the whole thing might have been different. That's another subject altogether. But once there, once he was at the peace conference and the U.S. was in the war, at least he was saying, the U.S. should not be in charge of any of these areas. In other words, it forswore being named a mandatory state over one of these areas. So that was good. And then at least the American delegation also said, well, why don't we find out what people there think, namely the Arabs. They were the overwhelming majority of people there. So there was supposed to be this tripartite commission of French, English, and French. This is all during while the peace conference is going on, to go over there and actually interview people, survey people. Well, the French at first and the British at first agreed, but then they had absolutely no interest in finding out what people thought. I think they knew what the answer was already, so they never sent anybody. So only the American delegation went, and so it's become known as the King-Crane Commission, which was named after the 2 co-chairs that Wilson named. And it was Henry Churchill King, who was the president of Oberlin College in Ohio, and a Chicago businessman by the name of Charles Crane. Well, they went over and spent about a month in Syria, Lebanon, and then into Palestine. The British weren't too crazy about them coming into Mesopotamia because they didn't want to hear a lot of anti-British stuff. So they pretty much confined them to mostly areas where the French were hoping to rule. And while there was not unanimity over any one point of view, there was a very strong feeling, which King and Crane reported back in their report, that they wanted independence. The Arabs wanted independence. The funny thing is, their second choice, if there had to be a mandate system, they wanted America to be the overseers. They at least liked the sounds that Wilson was making about self-determination and thought, oh, we'll probably get a better deal with the Americans there than with the British and the French. This report wrote all this up. It also pointed out that the Arabs were very nervous about the Balfour Declaration. They saw the handwriting on the wall that meant a state, a political state, that was going to be designated a Jewish state in Palestine. They thought that would be a problem for them because, after all, it was giving away someone else's land. And so the King and Crane pointed this out. But the report was kept secret. It was never even published until 1922, and it didn't matter at all to the French and the British. They didn't really care what the Arabs thought. They had their plan, and they were going to go ahead with it no matter what.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that this is another legacy of World War I. We often are told that World War II is the good war, despite the fact that it turned Eastern Europe and East Germany over to the Soviet communists for the next 50 years or so. But how many people really realize that World War II is just a direct outgrowth, maybe a continuation of World War I? And here you had this massive loss of life, terrible brutality in World War I, the trench warfare and so forth. But it was all designed to make the world safe for democracy, to end all wars, and this is Wilson's rationale. I mean, there was absolutely no reason for the U.S. to get involved in that war. And, in fact, U.S. intervention arguably even leads to the conditions that give rise to Hitler with the Treaty of Versailles, the humiliating terms of that agreement as compared to what would have been a negotiated treaty. But here you have another perverse outcome of this war. This entire Middle East area, which has been, decades of chaos and crisis and death and destruction and violence. And seems to me all rooted in this big intervention known as World War I. What do you think about that?
No, it's true. We're living with the problems that were sown in World War I and the peace conference. And you got crazy things like in Syria, you have basically an offshoot of Shiite Islam ruling a majority Sunni. And but in Iraq, you had, until Saddam was overthrown, you had a minority Sunni ruling a majority Shiite. And so that then explains that when the U.S. went in and toppled Saddam Hussein's government, the Shiites had scores to settle, and so there was violence. The Sunni obviously feared that, so you had Sunni insurgents against the U.S. and violence against the Shiite. That was somewhat quieted down by certain U.S. efforts, like facilitating the sectarian cleansing of Baghdad, so that it became pretty much a Shiite city rather than half and half Sunni Shiite. And Iraqi Sunnis were paid by the U.S. to kill al-Qaeda, who were foreign fighters, although that's something that the Sunni of Iraq were already willing to do, but they facilitated that, so that quieted that down. But then, once the Shiite government of Maliki, by the way, who was picked by Iran, which of course is Shiite Muslim, once he consolidated his power, he started oppressing Sunnis, and arresting even the vice president of the country, who was a Sunni, shooting on peaceful demonstrators. And so now the Sunnis, who were willing to kill al-Qaeda in the mid 2000, around 2006, 7, 8, in there, are now joining up with the foreign fighters, the radical Sunnis, in order to march on Baghdad. So all of this has been created by the outside interference, and the outside interference has never quit, because even after World War II, when Britain was exhausted and couldn't manage the Middle East any longer, and France was same with France, the U.S. stepped in, because the U.S. then felt, okay, we're the surviving superpower, we're the new superpower, we're the new guy on the block. And they set up their own empire. Now, they didn't call it an empire, they didn't call them colonies, but they just changed the words. They still put their own clients in charge of governments. They helped overthrow a monarchy in Iraq, which led eventually to the Baathists and Saddam Hussein. They did that all around the place. And so that region has not been allowed to evolve on its own. I think that's one of the fundamental problems, and we're suffering with it from that today.
Well, let me ask you, going back to that period with the Sykes-Picot agreement, how important a factor was oil in all this?
Well, the oil companies were interested. Standard Oil of New York had people there sort of undercover, not saying they were from Standard Oil, because there was they already knew about the potential for oil, and whether some was already being drilled, I'm not quite sure, but in the area of Mesopotamia, Iraq, they saw the potential for oil. I don't think the potential in the large peninsula, which is today Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I don't think they quite appreciated the potential there, and that's why those were not set up as mandates. That was allowed to be more or less independent, although it was divided and assigned to French and English spheres of influence, but they were not ruled the same way that Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq and Jordan were ruled.
Well, given where we are today with the chaos and the death, the destruction, the violence in this part of the world, the obvious question arises: what should the U.S. do, and what should the British do or the French do? And I think the libertarians just have it right on this, is that, look, they've caused enough damage here. The U.S. empire has caused enough damage. So has the British Empire. It's time to leave these people alone. And that, yes, that means they're still killing each other, which can be traced back to imperialism back, as you pointed out, early in the century. But by intervening again, sending more troops in, bombing more people, it's just throwing fuel on the fire. It's just making matters worse. And that it's really time for to me, Sheldon, this is a perfect opportunity for Americans to do some real soul searching here. Some real reevaluations of the whole national security state apparatus, the overseas troops, the overseas bases. Why do we need this? Is it reconcilable with a free society? What about interventionism? I mean, look at every single interventionism, including the world wars. Look at the consequences they've produced, along with all the rest of them, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of them have just been debacles. They've been disasters. And that what we can hope for out of this is the American people saying, time to do some real reevaluation and take things to a higher level here. Not just get out of Iraq or stay out of Iraq or get out of Afghanistan, but really do a complete reappraisal of things and say, is a national security state apparatus, is a CIA, is a big standing army, is a big military empire consistent with the principles of a free society? That's the way we lead the world out of this morass, Sheldon.
I think that's right. I mean, the history itself doesn't tell you what to do. You can't undo history. We can't go back, but it can let you know how you got where you are, and that could be a very good guide to how to get out of it and how to stop from making it worse.
All right, well, that's the show. That's the Libertarian Angle for this week. Enjoyed talking with y'all, and thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.